Welcome back, traveller. Tonight we're stepping onto the real road, where Oregon Trail hardships weren't a meme but a daily invoice paid in dust, thirst, and choices that never clapped for you. You'll taste alkali on your tongue, feel wagon train, life grind patience into skill, and see how overland migration built towns out of blisters, not fairy tales. We'll strip away trail reality versus myth, follow prairie schooners through rivers that didn't care, and watch frontier survival turn ordinary people into experts at staying alive when the map got rude. If that sounds brutal, good. Truth should sting before it teaches. But you'll also find the blueprint, 4 verbs, tight routines, and quiet courage that scaled from campfire to courthouse across the whole westward expansion. By the end, you'll read dust like a document and understand why so many kept going, even when the road kept taking. Before we dive in, smash that like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's see how far this wagon train stretches across the map. We stand in Independence, Missouri, where roads fray into rumor and sky. The air tastes like flour, dust, and iron, and ambition's a smell of its own. This is where overland migration stops being a headline and becomes your feat. You're choosing a pioneer journey, not a picnic, and that's the point. Posters promise westward expansion like a handshake with destiny, but the clerk who sells you axle grease knows trail reality versus myth by heart. Listen to the noise. Blacksmith hammers, oxen snorting, deals in half whispers. Children chase each other through a market of rope, bacon, and prayer. You check a wheel, then your courage, then the sky again. Same order. The merchants push essentials, but the list is a moral test. Every pound you pack is a debt you'll pay on a hill. Welcome to Oregon Trail hardships before the first mile even counts. You're buying a house on wheels. Ashwood, canvas, and stubborn hope. Folks call them prairie schooners because sails make lies feel lighter. A wagon looks roomy until you add flour, salt, and grief. You learn that space is ethics, overpacking is a future apology. Frontier survival starts with subtraction, not swagger. That's the first tuition payment in the School of Plains. Oxen or mules? It's a philosophy in leather and hay. Mules are wit, oxen are patience, and patience wins in mud. You run your hand along a yoke and feel tomorrow's blisters. Feed is weight, weight is time, time is graves or shade. Wagon train, life runs on math. Your all wrists will memorize. Every choice is a ripple in a creek you haven't met yet. Now, people, because people are the road as much as ruts are. A parson who can mend boots is worth 2 sermons, by August Dopp. A widow with map sense is a compass disguised as courage. You join a company because going alone is poetry that dies early. In overland migration, a good captain is better than a lucky morning. Take character over charisma, and the miles will thank you. Supplies look boring until boredom becomes survival's favorite flavor. Flour, beans, coffee, bacon, salt. Unromantic, unskippable syllables. You lay them out like a budget that will eat you if you cheat. A tin of tea becomes morale stored in leaves, and maybe mercy. The scale teaches humility faster than any preacher could. By dusk, you understand trail reality versus myth in ounces. You sign the rules of the road, when to start, when to halt, who scouts. No shooting at birds for pride, no midnight wandering for stories. Guard duty rotates, tempers get rations like everything else. Democracy on wheels sounds cute until rain edits the minutes. Still, shared law beats shared silence when wheels sink. Wagon train life is culture made of promises that squeak. Smell the animals, the tar, the raw boards, your new neighborhood. Canvas breathes a little, flaps a little, complains like a friend. You tuck keepsakes in a box smaller than your former desk drawer. Luxury now is dry socks and a spoon that never lies. Frontier survival is a shrine to tools that say yes daily. And yes, you'll love the coffee you once ignored. Then the leaving. Oh, the leaving doesn't feel like a trumpet. It's a long exhale, a cluck to the team, a last look that lingers. Road dust baptizes your boots into a church without walls. The town shrinks to a rumor you used to believe in. Every creak of the wagon is a contract you just signed. Oregon Trail hardships smile thinly and say, welcome to honest. First miles are lies. Easy ground, bright chatter, jokes with knees. You think you're built for this. The road is polite enough to nod. Then the shoulders begin to whisper about tomorrow's weight. Blisters appear like punctuation, making sense of pride. You notice how the horizon moves exactly as fast as you. That's the syllabus for the semester of dust. Night brings its own smell, cold earth, wood smoke, and doubts. Stars throw a net over you, dare you to sleep anyway. Coyotes argue philosophy beyond the circle of wagons. You realize fear is loudest when the fire gets modest. So you name the constellations like nicknames for courage, and the canvas roof becomes a heartbeat you can trust. Before sleep, you perform the rituals that keep tomorrow alive. Grease the hubs, check the lashings, bless the water barrel, share a joke that isn't brilliant but keeps the dark from bragging. In westward expansion, small kindness is heavy artillery. You tuck the map under your coat like a promise with edges. And somewhere ahead, a river waits to see if you meant it. The first week teaches faster than any preacher with a bell. Creaking wheels argue with rutted tracks while prairie winds heckle. Canvas flapping above you becomes a sky made of chores. Choking dust turns your tongue into alkali chalk at noon. This is Oregon Trail hardships without the postcard filter. Call it a nightmare trek, or call it school. Either way, you learn. Your prairie schooners aren't ships. They're promises with splinters. Axle grease oozes like pen ink on a long, angry sentence. Broken tongues and wheels are pop quizzes you can skip. Yokes bite shoulders. Raw rope burns. Teach humility quickly. Wagon train. Life runs on patience with a squeaky soundtrack. And every squeak is a vote against trail reality versus myth. Water is a rumor. The road keeps forgetting to prove. The Platte River looks generous, but tastes like history's bathwater. Alkali powder coats lips. Dehydration edits jokes into whispers. You cache barrels in shade. And prey clouds don't have a sense of humor. In overland migration, first is the foreman with a short fuse. Your tin cup clatters like a metronome for caution. Disease travels faster than wheels when camps forget their manners. Deaded, the dreaded bloody flux arrives with a wet cough of shame. Cholera, typhoid, camp fever, names that sound like receipts for grief. Foul latrines become villains when distance is ignored. So you learn spade etiquette and boil like your life owes interest. This is frontier survival as chemistry, not bravado. Death is unsentimental and terribly efficient out here. Shallow graves hide in grass. Trailside crosses squint at wind. Willow markers lean. Mournful cairns don't answer back. Sometimes it's river drownings. Sometimes a snakebite wins. Other nights it's an accidental shooting no one will retell loudly. Silent, grief walks the prairie beside the wheels and doesn't complain. Logistics become theology. Measure, ration, then forgive yourself. Hardtack and salt pork taste like contracts signed in salt. Coffee is morale stored in a tin. Open wisely, share widely. You count beans like blessings and bacon like promises. A good pioneer journey is arithmetic disguised as courage. Shortcuts? They collect interest payable in blisters and regret. Weather treats schedules like suggestions with punchlines. Blistering heat needs. You flat, hail squalls, play snare drum on canvas. Prairie lightning erases speeches mid-sentence. You nod and duck. Sudden torrents turn gullies into quicksand banks fast. Then frost nights arrive early, just to brag about Montana's cousins. Welcome to westward expansion, where the sky writes the minutes. Rivers are exams with no extra credit. You corked wagons so they'll float. They argue and sometimes sulk. Swollen rivers bargain for oxen and hats you loved yesterday. Ford can be honest today and treacherous by supper. When sand-choked axles kneel, everyone learns a new prayer. Trail reality versus myth. The river doesn't read pamphlets. Waypoints become applause. Breaks your bones can hear. Fort Kearney means letters. Fort Laramie means rumours and mending. Chimney Rock and Scott's Bluff stand like theatre props for grit. They don't give water, but they lend patience a taller spine. Each landmark is a handshake saying, "You still mean this," and your map stops being paper and becomes pulse. Camp is a small city that assembles and vanishes nightly. Wagon circle camp. Fires ringed, wood smoke mornings rehearsed. Mutual aid swaps tools, and quarrels and fatigue swap cheeks. Homesickness sits by the stew and pretends to be steam. Pioneer resolve arrives late, but stays to wash dishes. This is wagon train, life as democracy with sore feet. You carry 2 clocks, the sun and your animals. Oxen versus mules isn't fashion. It's risk management with ears. Feed turns into miles. Miles into sleep. You'll defend with jokes. When a team balks, the whole day gets rewritten in mudstop. So you trade songs for steps and tempers for inches. Threatened is frontier survival. You can hum Norati. At dusk, the prairie gets chatty. Coyotes yipping at dusk, wind in grass. You inventory hope against misery on the trail, and find a margin. A whispered prayer, a mended strap, a shared apple slice. You're not winning. You're continuing, and that's the braver verb. Tomorrow, the South Pass waits like a rumour with teeth. We'll get there, but only if you pack your patience where you can reach it. You hitch your fate to the Platte and let the river teach. It sprawls wide and shallow, a lazy map with muddy opinions. Banks glitter with mica, mosquitoes file taxes on your patience. Canvas flapping answers, prairie wind like a tired hymn. Prairie schooners creep while creaking wheels. Keep honest time. This is overland migration where water is compass and judge. Following the Platte sounds easy until the smell says otherwise. It tastes like warm coins and alkali, a mouthful of geography. Boiling looks heroic, but only blunts the sarcasm. You ration sweet water, like birthdays label every barrel. Tin cups clatter. Throats vote yes or mutiny softly. Welcome to Oregon Trail hardships, delivered in sips, not speeches. Grass is everything, fuel for miles disguised as lunch for oxen. Green belts along the river, keep hooves from writing complaints. Stray too far, and the prairie offers straw with attitude. You read colour like scripture, scouting for darker promises. Camp near water, but not near mosquitoes with lawyers. Frontier survival begins where grazing meets common sense. Landmarks rise like theatre props for tired courage. Chimney Rock points west with a sandstone finger and a grin. Scott's Bluff holds the horizon still long enough to breathe. These aren't fountains. They're morale with shadows attached. Children gasp. Captains quietly recalculate rations and miles. Trail reality versus myth shrugs and lets you have the moment. Fort Kearney arrives like punctuation. Order, mail, rumour, repairs. Prices feel personal. Your Axel hears the argument and agrees. Blacksmith sparks smell better than sermons after 3 bad days. You trade bacon for bolts and self-respect for decent coffee. Soldiers count wagons. You count blessings you paid retail for. Wagon train life is commerce, teaching ethics with receipts. The platforks like a question you can't dodge. North or south, each with gossip, drownings, and weather debts. Captains gather maps, opinions, and courage into a vote. Inches on paper become weeks in dust and prayer. Choose the rumour with better grass and fewer headlines. Pioneer journey means decisions that don't clap when you finish. Rivers turn from guides to exams. Without warning, fordable note from last week lies with a smile. Swollen rivers, audition your hubris with cold hands. You caulk wagons until canvas smells like shipyard jokes. Oxen snort theology. Ropes bite, raw rope burns anew. If someone sings, it's to measure fear, not bravery. Accidents are quiet, and accountant cold at crossings. A girl slips, a hat floats, the log says nothing. We stack stones. Shallow graves lean toward the current's logic. No trumpets, just a line moving, because it must are. Crosses tilt, and mournful cairns memorize our handwriting. Westward expansion keeps the ledger. We keep walking. Fort towns reset tempers, but can't launder miles from bones. Mend broken tongues and wheels and tempers in the same hour. Quartermaster chalk feels like winter on a July wrist. A letter home is courage folded twice and kissed. Some sell heirlooms to buy one more gamble of grease. Oregon Trail hardships prefer cash, not poetry. Discipline becomes kindness disguised as boredom. Wait before sun. Grease hubs, check lashings, bless the water. Breakfast is hardtack and salt pork that says, chew humility. Guard duty rotates so resentment never gets rhythm. Rules save friendships from weather and opinions. That's wagon train life as democracy with sore feet. Weather edits every plan with a composer's arrogance. Blistering heat, irons thoughts flat. Hail squalls jab like punctuation. Prairie lightning drafts its own constitution in one clause. A sudden torrent rehearses drowning where dust lived yesterday. You learn to read clouds, like contracts with tricky ink. Frontier survival equals forecast plus forgiveness. By dusk, the river glows like a rumour of mercy. Board smoke mornings are traded for cricket choirs and coyotes. Marches and theos and cartizans. Hutsional coyoten. You tie down hope with the same knots as the feed sacks. A whispered prayer shares a tin cup with a dirty joke. Ahead lies Fort Laramie, and behind, what can't be carried. Tomorrow we climb towards South Pass, where altitude bargains with breath. You roll into Fort Laramie with wheels that sound like confessions. Canvas sighs, oxen steam, and your bones vote for benches immediately. This is a trading post that smells of tallow, tobacco, and history. Rumours stack higher than flour sacks. Prices argue with your pride. Wagon train life pauses here to mend iron and tempers. Trail reality versus myth starts itemizing the bill, line by line. Blacksmith sparks are little sermons about forgiveness. A rampant rim means tomorrow. A new axle grease tin means mercy. Children stare at soldiers like walking tin toys with muskets. You trade bacon for nails and overconfidence for spare spokes. In overland migration, humility is the cheapest currency going. Pay it before the prairie charges interest you'll hate. Parade ground doubles as post office and rumour mill. A letter from home unfolds a second sky in your hands. Some folks quit here, sell wagons, buy stories, turn back east. Their eyes look older than the fort's adobe cornice. You bless their honesty and keep your foolish bravery anyway. This is pioneer journey as personal math, not universal truth. Treaty ground etiquette requires quieter boots and open palms. Trade blankets become dictionaries when languages squint at each other. Gifts move first, then words find courage, then hands agree. You learn that westward expansion always sits across from someone's home. Carry respect like water, spill neither if you can help it. That's frontier survival measured in listening, not only miles. Out on the trail again, the bluffs stand like stern librarians. Wind reads your hat and edits it into the grass. Sagebrush plains scrape your ankles, grit storms abrade your patience. The track hardens, then vanishes under prairie winds with opinions. Prairie schooners tilt like stubborn swans and keep going. Your shoulders finally accept their lifetime subscription to ache. The Sweetwater River arrives with the sound of a bell you needed. Cold, bright, persuasive. Water that tastes like apologies accepted. You soak boots, not maps. You learn to love shallow stones. Baskets of laundry turn the bank into a moving village. Wood smoke mornings return, and coffee stops sounding like a rumour. For an hour, Oregon Trail hardships loosen their jaw. Then in Independence, rock rises, a granite guest book under the sun. You touch the names and feel time reaching back to hold your wrist. Carve nothing if you're wise, carry everything if you're not. The wind sings vowels your school teacher never mentioned. Kids race lizards, captains counts and reconsidered dates. Trail reality versus myth leans closer and smiles without teeth. Storms practice percussion on the high plain without asking permission. Hail squalls drum your canvas. Prairie lightning signs spectacular autographs. You anchor tents, rescue hats, and apologize to the stew twice. When the sky clears, every color feels rinsed and sharp. Fatigue steps back, resolve ties its shoes again. That's wagon train. Weather as coach, not just critic. Approach south, pass, like a polite request to the continent. There's no cliff, only altitude politely wearing prairie clothes. Breath grows thoughtful, hooves grow deliberate, jokes lose adjectives. Snow whispers, rumours even in August, just to keep you modest. You crest the divide and feel two oceans reconsider your future. Overland migration becomes geography. You can taste. On the far side, rivers choose the Pacific with quiet confidence. Wind rearranges your hair, and maybe your personality. You notice arguments got smaller at altitude. Keep that trick. Mornings bite. Noon forgives. Evenings steal heat like pickpockets. Frontier survival becomes layering, pacing, and honest water breaks. Pride walks behind the wagon until it learns to help. Camps up here sound thinner. Fewer crickets, more stars. Tin cups clink like restrained bells across the circle. Stories travel slower, but stick better when they land. Mutual aid shows up early quarrels, and fatigue show up late. Homesickness tastes like bacon grease and cold spoons. Still, pioneer resolve is a blanket that fits everyone eventually. You leave the pass with a new clock in your chest. It ticks to wind, not town bells, and it's strangely kind. Ahead, Fort Hall, Soda Springs, and decisions with teeth. Behind, bluffs, letters, and the names you didn't carve. Oregon Trail hardships aren't finished. They're just better lit. And tomorrow, the Snake River will test whether your courage can swim. You reach Fort Hall, expecting salvation, and find a ledger with manners. The place smells of leather dust and boiled coffee, and every conversation is a price tag in disguise. Traders talk straight, fewer illusions, more axle grease, and news about the road ahead that lands like a cold cloth. This is where overland migration tightens its belt, and you discover that optimism is heavy. You're still committed to the pioneer journey, but now you count miles in beans and bandages. Welcome to trail reality versus myth, where even the handshakes feel rationed. The Snake River does not care how brave you sound at camp. Its banks are as beautiful as a trap, with slick stones, cold currents, and a habit of stealing oxen mid-negotiation. People call it a guide. Your bones call it an exam with no retake. You test fords, argue about ferries, and listen to the wind for the kind of advice maps never give. This is Oregon Trail hardships distilled to a single crossing. Move right or swim wrong. You'll remember the taste of that water longer than most speeches. Fort Hall offers repairs, rumors, and that dangerous thing called choice. Head towards Soda Springs for a morale stop. The fizzing water is novelty and medicine, or push on while the weather's your friend and not your editor. Everyone you meet describes a different nightmare, and strangely that helps. Shared fear puts steel in your spine. You trade a blanket for nails and a story for a better route note. In Wagon Train, life gossip is currency, and sometimes guidance. The smartest captains buy both. The Snake Country's terrain is a geography lesson written by a prankster. Sun-baked benches collapse into ravines. Sagebrush plains turn to badlands without warning. You feel prairie winds bully the canvas while grit storms abrade patience into powder. Axles complain like old men, and sand-choked hubs demand another hour you didn't budget. This is frontier survival by maintenance, not heroics. Nothing glamorous, everything necessary. Disease keeps pace because camps get sloppy when spirits sink. The bloody flux whispers through the wagons, cholera lurks in hurried scoops of river water, and dehydration edits conversations into grunts. You relearn spade etiquette, push latrines downwind, and boil until there's nothing left to argue with. Every tin cup becomes a moral decision in your palm. Trail reality versus myth. Myth doesn't do laundry at midnight. At Soda Springs, the earth hisses like a kettle, and people smile for the first time in weeks. Children laugh at the bubbles. Mothers wash grief from collars, and someone swears the mineral tank fixed his cough. The moment is small, but it tastes like permission to continue. You're reminded that westward expansion wasn't a single roar, but millions of tiny knots. A little fizz, a little stew, and feet that forgive you for another day. Beyond the brief comforts lies the cartel of rocks and rivers that will bill you in bruises. Engineer. Corked wagons, line up ropes, and choreograph oxen, like a reluctant ballet. A misstep means river drownings no one will sing about. A slip of the trigger means an accidental shooting you won't forget. When someone asks why you keep going, you point at the horizon and shrug. That's the entire answer. The pioneer journey isn't about victory, it's about motion with a reason. Then comes the great debate that splits friendships and timelines. The Dalles with its dangerous Columbia Drift, or the Barlow Road around Mount Hood with tolls and heartbreak in the ruts. Ferries and rafts sound like courage until the water explains the invoice. The mountain route promises ground underfoot, plus fallen timber, steep pitches and oxen that learn new curse words. Either way, you pay in coin, animals, or sleep. Wagon. Train life is a spreadsheet written in mud. Supply math takes over your mouth, which may be a blessing. Hardtack and salt pork teach gratitude, and coffee becomes diplomacy in a tin cup. You ration smiles alongside bacon. You ration stories so they land when you need them. When the barrel looks low, someone finds a water cache you didn't believe in. In overland migration, luck prefers the teams that schedule it. People change here, and not always kindly. Mutual aid shows up at dawn. Quarrels and fatigue clock in at dusk. Homesickness sharpens its knife when coyotes start yipping. You discover your best friend is the one who fixes a brake pin without a speech. Resolve quiets down and hardens. Hope gets practical shoes. That's how frontier survival sneaks from idea to habit. Landmarks keep you honest because they refuse to clap. You pass a basalt pillar that looks like a giant's knuckle, and someone whispers that Chimney Rock already taught patience months ago. The sky seems closer, the grass meaner, and the wagon lighter in all the wrong places. You keep a running list of things you'll never overpack again. Oddly, gratitude grows in the same soil as blisters. Oregon Trail hardships are excellent teachers with terrible bedside manners. As you angle toward Oregon country, the air changes in a way that isn't poetic. It's moist and mossy, and smells like, maybe. You picture the Willamette Valley in the way the tired picture sleep, as an answer with a porch. But you're not there, not yet. There are toll gates to argue with, and rivers that haven't tried to kill you. Keep your team steady, your water honest, and your temper saved for work, not people. Tomorrow, the choice between Current and Corduroy Road will prove what kind of stubborn you've become. Ready to pick it on purpose? At the Dalles, the Columbia looks holy until you hear it. Then it sounds like a sawmill chewing iron, and your optimism blinks. Guides talk about rafts as if they're sensible furniture, and you stare at your wagon, which was never meant to float longer than a prayer. On paper, the plan is simple. Lash the box, ferry the families, drive the oxen along the bank, and promise the river you'll be interesting later. In reality, this is Oregon Trail hardships at full volume. Cold spray, slick rock, and currents that negotiate only in bruises. You feel the old split again. Trail reality versus myth. The picture book versus the invoice. And you're the cashier, trading courage for rope burns and a chance at tomorrow. The counteroffer is the Barlow Road, tolls nailed to a post, and a mountain wearing a grin. Round Mount Hood, the ruts run deep enough to hide a wheel, and every downhill is a committee meeting between gravity and regret. You pay coin at the gate, and then pay again with sweat, trees, and animals that suddenly know more swear words than you do. Still, ground underfoot has its own kind of mercy, and after weeks of water exams, dirt feels like competence. In wagon train, life choice often means deciding which receipt you'd rather keep. Either way, frontier survival demands you pick and move before weather picks for you. Rafting means carpentry under pressure. Dismantle the top works, seal seams with tar and hope, and learn knots you should have learned in April. You discover that prairie schooners can pretend to be boats if you talk nice, and don't ask them to prove it for very long. Men who claim to be strong swimmers admit they're strong waders, which is less helpful than advertised. The ferry operators know exactly how much fear costs per foot, and they charge accordingly because they've earned the right. Families huddle under slickers while the tin cup clatter becomes a nervous metronome. This is overland migration. As choreography you only rehearse once. Up on the Barlow, the forest smells like pitch and stubbornness, and the road takes a perverse delight in ambushing your brakes. You'll fell trees for skids, lower wagons on ropes that bite, and post teams at the rear like a living anchor. Oxen go from engines to brakes, and their eyes ask questions you can't answer with words. Rain turns corduroy sections into traps, and a fresh broken tongue can ruin 3 days of nice intentions. Yet the rhythm, halt, chop, lower, swear, repeat, creates community faster than any campfire story. Pioneer journey becomes a team sport, and everyone learns the same painful hymn. Disease still takes attendance, because choices don't grant immunity, they just change the exam format. On the river route, dysentery laughs at your buckets. On the mountain, dehydration sneaks in when cold air hides thirst. You police foul latrines, boil water until the pot complains, and barter herbs for hope at prices no one mentions. Someone mutters, "Bloody flux," and the camp gets quiet, the way churches do after a thunderclap. Good habits, distance, clean spades, shared kettles, are the cheapest medicine. That's frontier survival as protocol, not luck. Accidents hold their own court and never lack jurors. On the river drownings happen without speeches, and hats float downstream like warnings wearing brims. On the road, a snapped brake rope turns into crushed spokes, and a story nobody wants to tell in front of children. You practice firearm discipline because accidental shootings are the kind of tragedy that steals whole winters from hearts. Every mile teaches, tie it twice, test once, and let pride walk behind until it can carry something useful. In westward expansion, humility arrives early. Arrogance arrives late and leaves louder. Logistics run like a second bloodstream through every decision. With rafts you stage loads, flour, then families, then tools. Because the river hates improvisation. With Barlow you rotate oxen, double team climbs, and ration axle grease like it's a sermon about foresight. Supplies thin either way, and the hardtack and salt pork suddenly taste like courage you can chew. You create water caches where you can, because the map sometimes lies, and your throat never does. That's wagon train life in ledger form, ounces turning into miles. Morale is a tool, not a mood, and you use it with intention. At the Dallas, someone cracks a joke that isn't funny and saves 3 people anyway. On the Barlow, kids gather pitch cones, mothers braided stray ribbon into a hat band, and hope becomes visible again. You trade songs with the next wagon, because songs weigh nothing and do everything. Mutual aid stops being a phrase and becomes the way your hands move without asking permission. The pioneer journey gets quieter, which is how you know it's working. Landmarks change their tone from taunting to tutoring as you close in. Mount Hood appears and disappears like a ghost with deadlines, and the forest teaches patience by example. If you chose the river, the Cascade Rapids remind you that the Columbia still owns the punctuation. If you chose the road, Tollgate nails the day to your purse and your pride, and you pay both with a steady face. Either route leaves a mark on your hands that soap can't find. Trail reality versus myth stops arguing, it just nods. Weather reserves the right to edit the last act. Early snows can ambush the ridges, and hail squalls can turn fir needles into knives. Down by the water, fog eats distance and makes voices feel like lies. You watch the sky, the way bankers watch interest, and you move when the numbers say, "Now." Even the coyotes keep a respectful distance from this mouth. That's Oregon Trail hardships with a stopwatch. When the valley air finally changes, wet, green, and generous, you almost don't trust it. The Willamette Valley smells like things that grow without asking your permission first, and the sound of water no longer sounds like an accusation. You imagine a roof, a fence line, and a door that closes on purpose instead of whim. But you still have tolls to settle animals to count, and a last ridge that insists on a price. Arrival is never a single moment. It's a series of small permissions granted by landscape and luck. Tomorrow you'll see whether the promise matches the porch. Hold that breath, because the last miles have their own games, claims, land laws, and the first winter that tests whether you learned anything at all. The circle of wagons will turn to a grid of cabins, and chores will outvote stories until stories catch up again. I'll show you how settlers turned road habits into town habits, why some thrived and some vanished, and how overland migration ended in a new kind of grind. You'll taste sawdust, hear the thud of fence posts, and feel how patience mutates into permanence. The journey doesn't end. It changes verbs from moving to making, ready to step off the road without losing what the road taught you. You step into the Willamette with a kind of disbelief that smells like wet cedar and possibility. The air is soft, mossy, and absolutely uninterested in your resume. It wants fences, not speeches. After months of Oregon Trail hardships, your first real job is to pick a rectangle of earth and convince it you belong. That means learning the grammar of stakes, corners, and neighborly distance, plus land office etiquette that makes the blacksmith line at Fort Laramie look friendly. Trail reality versus myth snaps into focus here. Nobody hands you a farm because you survived. You still have to build it before weather edits you back into a story. The pioneer journey didn't end. It just changed verbs from moving to making. The wagon becomes a lumberyard with wheels, and you finally admit the obvious. Those beloved prairie schooners were only ever meant to get you to the job site. You unlash planks that smell like rain-soaked vows and measure walls by arm span and argument. Every board is a decision. Door here for light, door there for wind, door nowhere because nails are almost a religion. One person swings an axe with rhythm. Another chisels joints like they're writing their name on the future. In wagon train life, talent was morale. In settlement life, talent is survival. Frontier survival rewards the good listener with warm nights. Tools sing different music now. Saws rasp, mallets thud, and the first time your ridgepole stands, it feels like signing a peace treaty with gravity. You learn to love square and plumb as if they were virtues, because out here they are. Bark under your nails becomes a kind of diploma. Even the oxen seem relieved. They were built for hauling, but they prefer watching you switch careers. After the relentless grind of overland migration, the sound of a hinge testing itself is practically opera. And yes, you still grease axles, only now the road is the distance between cabin and creek. Food stops being rations and becomes strategy. You plant late crops because the soil looks like it wants to forgive you, then immediately hedge that bet with traps, fishing lines, and a smokehouse that smells like persistence. Hardtack and salt pork fall to the supporting cast, while beans, squash, and salmon audition for permanent roles. Coffee remains sacred, but now it tastes less like rescue and more like planning. The pantry is your first bank. Jars and sacks are your first legal counsel. It's westward expansion, translated into shelves. Community builds itself out of need, before it builds itself out of affection. You trade fence rails for a day with the neighbour's team, swap seed potatoes for a hand at the roof line, lend a draw knife and get a pie that might make you cry. The old rules from wagon train life, mutual aid, shared watches, calm voices, carry over almost perfectly. Quarrels still arrive at dusk, but they leave earlier when there's a barn to raise in the morning. You start to recognize whose jokes keep rain out of a day. That's trail reality versus myth at the village scale. Illness didn't retire when you parked the wagon. In damp cabins, dysentery rebrands as carelessness with the spring. Camp fever sneaks in when bedding gets lazy. Contaminated water is still the cheapest villain on the frontier. You build latrines downwind and far off, boil like a zealot, and make hand-washing a habit rather than a sermon. A corner shelf becomes the medicine chest, willow bark, clean cloth, and a kind voice that reminds people to sip. That's frontier survival as hygiene, not heroics. You outlearn symptoms faster than you outmuscle them. Winter drafts the contract you've been pretending not to read. Early frosts test your roof pitch. Sot chinking tells you where your logic had holes. Firewood piles translate to nights lived. Every missing chord is an IOU to February. You hang blankets inside like extra walls and discover the genius of small rooms. Less to heat, more to love. Coyotes yip at dusk and the sound no longer feels like taunting. It feels like a weather report. Oregon Trail hardships never left. They just changed costumes. Emotionally, the valley is kinder and stranger all at once. The silence is thick enough to hear your old towns rattling around in your chest. Homesickness comes to visit when the stew goes quiet and the candle burns low, but so does gratitude carrying the same ladle. You mark a tree for a future orchard, and to your surprise, it steadies your breathing. Pioneer resolve learns to whisper instead of shout. That whisper is how work gets finished when daylight goes stingy. Land and law flirt, then argue, then compromise. You discover that boundary lines are straight only on paper, that streams move like they own the place, and that your neighbour's best fence posts lean toward your best pasture. Meetings in a one-room school or borrowed barn become the new wagon circle camp. Voices in a circle, problems on the table, decisions that taste like work. People who led on the trail don't always lead in town. Sometimes the quiet millwright becomes mayor by accident. Trail reality versus myth also applies to leadership. The memory of the road doesn't vanish. It hardens into a skill set. You still scan the sky like a captain. You still pack tools like a quartermaster. And you still read hoofprints like minutes from a meeting. Those road habits become township habits. Ditch days, shared bridges, loaner oxen for anyone whose team fell through the ice. Overland migration was a university. The valley is the career. When a newcomer rolls in, you can tell in 20 seconds whether they studied. Death is here too, but it's quieter. Instead of trailside crosses, there are small plots by a fir tree, names carved with more patience, and graves deep enough to make weather respect them. You still leave willow markers sometimes, but now you keep a ledger so grief doesn't go missing. If a cabin goes dark, the neighborhood absorbs it like a stitched wound. Mourning on the frontier is a chore with love in it, and chores are how you heal. Oregon Trail hardships taught you the price of motion. Settlement teaches you the price of staying. By late winter, your cabin smells like smoke, sourdough, and a plan. Tools hang in a row that could be a family portrait. The creek is a little less arrogant. It remembers your buckets. When spring finally walks in, you meet it at the door with seed in one hand and a fence staple in the other. That's the quiet victory of westward expansion. Nobody writes songs about. You made a door that opens both ways. And just beyond that door waits the next chapter. Roads you'll cut to the mill, deals you'll make with the weather, and the first harvest that will tell you whether the valley agrees with your name. The second year begins with a different kind of map. Not a horizon, but a web. You sketch a road to the mill because flour is a daily election and nobody wants to lose it. A path to the ferry follows because a town that can cross its river is just a tidy pen. Soon, there's a trail to the school, a trace to the pasture, and a straight shot to the neighbour who always has spare nails. What overland migration taught in motion, the settlement now translates into connections. This is still the pioneer journey, only the miles are shorter, and the stakes feel bigger because they're nailed down. Mills change everything. A sawmill turns trees into vocabulary. Studs, joists, rafters. A grist mill turns grain into time you can eat. You hear the wheel thrum and realize prosperity has a sound half river, half intention. Farmers learn to stagger threshing days so the miller doesn't become a tyrant by accident. When belts slip or teeth crack, the entire valley feels it in its stomach. In frontier survival, a broken mill is louder than any sermon. Commerce grows out of habit, the way moss grows out of shade. A market day appears almost without permission. Hides stacked, onions traded, a new kettle, admired with the seriousness usually reserved for newborns. Families who shared stew on the trail now argue politely about bean prices and axle pins. The dance is familiar because wagon train life already taught the rhythm. Bargain, shake hands, keep your word. Here, the handshake becomes the first local currency, and reputation becomes the bank. Law follows, sometimes with boots, too big, and sometimes exactly on time. A justice of the peace moves a table under a maple, and the county is, for all practical purposes. Boundary disputes turn into measured conversations, rather than measured paces with rifles, and that's an upgrade no one takes for granted. You learn to file deeds, witness signatures, and tolerate speeches. It's not glamorous, but neither was greasing hubs. Both keep wheels from eating themselves. Trail reality versus myth had promised glory. The real victory is paperwork that outlives tempers. Roadwork becomes the new muster. Ditch days are announced by a neighbour's knock, and a grin you learn to love and dread in equal measure. Everyone brings a tool, spade, mattock, strong opinions. You slope the grade, so water minds its manners, crown the track so wagons don't drown in their own ruts, and lay corduroy over boggy places with a patience that feels like prayer. Afterward, the road looks simple, which is how you know it's good. In westward expansion, the most honest monuments are the ones nobody points at. Bridges are diplomas. You hang over water. The first is just poles and nerve. The second has braces that sunset light understands. The third has a toll because timber doesn't fall for free, and neither does your back. Ferrymen and bridgemen become micro-mayors, deciding who crosses first when the river argues. You realize leadership moved from camp captains to craftsmen without anyone printing a proclamation. That's how Oregon Trail hardships transform into institutions. Quietly, after lunch. Supply lines mature from guesswork to choreography. A freighter with wagons brings iron cloth and gossip in equal measure. He leaves with hides, wheat, and promises. Suddenly, the word surplus doesn't sound like boasting. It sounds like winter insurance. You learn to read crates the way you once read clouds. Coffee becomes affordable enough to taste less like ceremony and more like mourning. The pioneer journey is still underwritten by beans and bacon. Now there's a ledger that proves it. Schools, churches, and halls arrive not as luxuries but as tools. A school keeps children from becoming complete strangers to words. A church keeps adults from becoming complete strangers to restraint. A hall gives arguments a roof, so rain isn't the only thing cooling heads. People who learn to circle wagons now learn to arrange benches, and the geometry feels familiar. All faces visible, all voices heard, no one too far from the door. Frontier survival means building places where hope can sit down without apologizing. Conflict doesn't vanish, it evolves. Someone accuses someone of skimming at the scales. Someone builds a fence 2 steps into someone else's good grass. And somebody's dog discovers the mayor's chickens. You call a meeting, pass around a tin cup, and let calm people speak first. The solution is rarely clever and always fair enough. That, fair enough, is the civilization you carried across a continent in a wooden box called manners. It's still wagon train life, just dressed for town. Trade routes widen, and suddenly strangers wear familiar faces. A trapper you cursed on the trail now sells you a winter cloak that keeps your lungs intact. A woman who fixed harness with a look now runs a store that saves marriages by selling the right nails. Stage lines whisper rumors of cities and newspapers and somebody's gold strike that keeps not happening to you. You smile, sweep your step, and keep stacking cordwood. Trail reality versus myth becomes a punchline. You tell only to people who've set their posts straight. The land answers you differently after 2 harvests. Fields no longer look like threats. They look like allies that ask for clear sentences. Plow, rest, rotate, mend. The creek that once stole your buckets now counts minutes for your wheel. Coyotes still yip at dusk, but you've learned they also eat the mice that would have eaten your grain. Even grief changes shape. Fewer shallow graves, more tended plots with names that smile back. Overland migration taught motion. The valley teaches membership. And yet, when the wind is right and the chores are late, you still taste dust you haven't breathed in a year. The old road walks through your bones and reminds you who you became along it. You keep the habits that didn't break. Early starts, shared tools, jokes that arrive before despair does. That's the quiet trophy of frontier survival. Not the cabin, not the field, but the reflex to help first and brag never. Tomorrow we'll step inside a family's day, to watch how a household turns the trail's grit into a life that keeps paying for itself. Dawn begins with stove breath and a rooster who thinks he's a bell. You wake to wood smoke and damp wool, stretch the small of your back and listen for oxen, shifting in the corral like old furniture. Coffee rattles in the grinder. A skillet complains in bacon dialect. Children negotiate blankets as if they were boarders. This is where Oregon Trail hardships got repackaged into chores. Water first, fire second, words last. A good morning is logistics with manners, and you learn that victory smells like ash and pancake. In the grammar of frontier survival, verbs come before adjectives. While the sun climbs a knuckle above the firs, you run the checklist that made Wagon Train life endurable. Hubs get a dab of leftover axle grease, not because you're rolling far today, but because maintenance is a religion that doesn't retire. You check the roofline for last night's mischief, tighten a hinge, and send someone to the spring with a lidded bucket so contaminated water can't flirt its way inside. The same discipline that crossed rivers now crosses rooms. Trail reality versus myth had promised drama. The truth is calmer and more demanding. Your house runs on the habits the road taught you. Mid-morning is for tools and promises. You shoulder a saw that remembers your grip and turn logs into sentences the cabin can understand. Planks stack curls of pitchfall, and the yard begins to smell like a plan. Someone mends harness with a needle that looks too small for the job, and yet solves it. In this pioneer journey, improvisation has rules. Measure twice, swear once, and fix it so well your neighbor borrows the story. Westward expansion lives here, in the quiet applause of plum and square. Noon arrives with a soft emergency called hunger. The table is beans, onions, yesterday's bread, and a jar of something pickled that tastes like foresight. Children bang tin cups with the confidence of elected officials. You enforce hand washing because you remember dysentery and the bloody flux, like the bad neighbors they were. The conversation is inventory disguised as gossip. How many nails left? Which fence post sulked? Which cow believes in shortcuts? This is overland migration, translated into lunch math. You eat to work, not work to eat. Early afternoon splits the crew in two directions that meet again at supper. Field hands lay out rows as straight as rumors, while a pair of you rides fence, listening to wire sing when it's tight enough to hold a winter's plan. In the shed, somebody planes a door until it fits like a reason. In the garden, someone tucks beans under soil that smells like yes. You don't waste weather, you rent it by the hour. The valley's calendar replaces the trail's sun, but the urgency feels familiar. Mid-afternoon is for small crises with good endings. A calf tries diplomacy with the fence and loses. A hinge proposes retirement and is persuaded to stay one more season. A stove damper sticks and then remembers who built it. You carry a pocket toolkit, like a town carries a council. Tighten, loosen, replace. Forgive. Prairie schooners once held your spare parts. Now the wall pegs do. Frontier survival is never loud here. It's relentless and oddly cheerful. As the light slants, you make time for the work nobody claps for. Clear trins are checked, foul corners get lime, buckets and towels are rotated, so habits don't grow soft around the edges. A chore list hangs by the door, and every pencil mark is a tiny sermon about not getting sick for stupid reasons. The road taught you what trail reality versus myth does to people who skip the boring steps. You decide boredom is cheaper than funerals. Evening begins with a noise that sounds like gratitude hiding in soup. Bread warms, a story gets told for the third time, and still earns a grin. And the weariness in your shoulders votes for tomorrow. You read a bit, Bible ledger, a crumpled letter from someone who still thinks you're brave, and patch a shirt while you're at it because hands can listen while they mend. Outside, coyotes yip at dusk, which used to sound like threats and now sounds like punctuation. Wagon train life taught you to circle. Town life teaches you to stack. After supper, the village appears as if it lives under your porch. A neighbor stops by with a question disguised as a pipe. You loan a brace and get a promise of help on ditch day. Someone mentions a meeting about a bridge that needs braces before flood season. Someone else knows where the good cedar stands. That's democracy with splinters, and it works. Westward expansion always needed a chorus. You finally have one. Night has its own ledger. Animals watered, coals banked, doors latched, tools stowed in places even the dark can remember. You set out a bucket against prairie lightning, because fires love sleepers, and you set out tomorrow's clothes, so dawn want need speeches. The roof creaks in the timber dialect, which you've learned to translate as, "We're fine." You didn't beat the wilderness. You negotiated a treaty with it. Oregon Trail hardships still audit the books, but the balance sheet smiles. Before bed, there's the quiet work of keeping souls from fraying. Someone writes 2 lines in a diary that doubles as a weather archive. Someone tunes a fiddle until the room agrees on key. Someone stitches a name into a quilt square as if to underline being here. Homesickness visits like a soft rain and leaves like one. 2 strong people who once lifted wheels now lift lullabies. This is pioneer journey as inheritance. Starlight finally drafts the last paragraph. You step outside and the air smells like wet grass and sawdust, and something that might be hope without an agenda. The road you came on is invisible, but its voice is still in your bones, telling you to stage your tools for morning. Check the bucket one more time, and be kind to whoever wakes first. The house behind you murmurs, the creek keeps minutes, and the sky looks like a ledger of promises you're steadily paying off. Tomorrow isn't guaranteed, but it is scheduled. That's the closest thing to victory the frontier ever hands out. You can map a settlement by the lines. Women draw that no surveyor ever records. Water to stove, cradle to garden, cow to churn, neighbor to neighbor. If Oregon Trail hardships were the public exam, this is the daily quiz that decides whether supper appears and the fever breaks by morning. You see it in the wash line that looks like courage hung to dry, and in the bread rising because someone remembered to mill, to mix, to watch, to wait. In Wagon Train, life women's labor was the ballast that kept the prairie schooners upright. In town, it's the flywheel that makes the whole machine run smooth. You learn to respect any job that looks small from a distance and enormous from an inch away. That's frontier survival without trumpet or headline. Breakfast is logistics disguised as kindness. Fire is coaxed from yesterday's coals. Kettles complain into coffee. A child's cough is read like a forecast. Spoons lay out the morning's map. Father to fence, mother to garden, older child to water, younger to keep the gate closed because goats believe in liberty. This is trail reality versus myth again. No heroic monologue, just practiced hands and the good sense to stage tools before hunger wins. You start to notice how much planning is baked into a pancake. Midwives are the town's quiet generals. They keep satchels staged, clean cloth, twine, pennyroyal, willow bark, and stories that can slow a heartbeat back to normal. On the road of overland migration, births happened in wagons. Now they happen in cabins with quilts hoisted and neighbours humming a steadying tune. But midwife knows when to send for a stronger back or a calmer voice, and when to tell every man in earshot to get useful or get out. Babies arrive on their own schedule. towns survive on hers. If you want to see westward expansion in a single scene, watch a midwife wash her hands and set the lamp just so. Childcare is an economy of wrists and jokes. Toddlers are taught fence distance, stove rules, and the two-word treaty with animals. Be gentle. Older kids become apprentices to everything. Milking, mending, seed saving, reading aloud, when hands are too busy to hold books. On long afternoons, somebody turns chores into games with a speed you wish you could hire. That's pioneer journey morale math. Banter buys attention, attention buys safety, safety buys tomorrow. Sickness is the auditor that never needs an appointment. Women keep the ledger. Who drank from which bucket? Who looked warm at breakfast? Who skipped appetite without cause? Dysentery, camp fever, the bloody flux, the same villains from the trail, still test the house, and boiling remains a sacrament. You see the medicine shelf grow purposeful. Mint for stomachs, chamomile for nerves, vinegar for floors, clean cloth for everything. Trail reality versus myth had promised that arrival was the cure. The truth is that prevention rents a room and never moves out. Clothing is more than warmth. It's a repairable bank account. A torn sleeve is a 30-minute loan. A worn knee gets a patch that extends the garment's life into another season's worth of harvests. Dye pots steam with onion skins and indigo rumours. Spinning wheels murmurs like well-fed cats. The sound is small and relentless, and it equals money saved. Pride kept, and nights warmer than they had any right to be. In Oregon Trail hardships, thread held wagons. Here it holds families. Hospitality is infrastructure with pie on top. A pot is always a little larger than the family requires, because someone might arrive with news need or the kind of story that must be heard before it evaporates. Women maintain a discreet intelligence network. Who's short on flour, who's grieving, whose fence lost an argument with wind. On the trail, mutual aid circled wagons. In town, it circles tables. Frontier survival keeps the extra bowl at the ready. Defense isn't only rifles, it's readiness. Women know where the lantern sits, which child can run fastest for help, and how to use the dog's bark as a map of what's wrong. They store water away from ash, keep tinder dry as a promise, and practice bucket lines without calling it practice. If a spark leaps from stove to curtain, 10 decisions happen in one breath, and none of them sound like panic. You learn that bravery on the frontier often wears an apron and sensible shoes. Money has a back door called butter and eggs. Women run side hustles before anyone coined the term. Candles traded for nails, soap for thread, garden surplus for a book that will be read aloud, until it's part of the family's bloodstream. Clutch of hens becomes an account you can balance every dawn. Wagon train life taught scarcity. Settlement teaches micro-enterprise with a smile, and change counted into a clean hand. The town's first banker might be the woman whose scale is never wrong. Sunday isn't rest. It's restoration. Clothes are brushed and mended, shoes inspected, songs rehearsed with children who half remember the trail but fully remember the sound of the fiddle. Women reset the week's rhythm, slipping notes to neighbours about ditch days, quilting bees, and who needs extra wood, stacked because a baby is coming. In a way, overland migration never stopped. It turned into a weekly procession to the schoolhouse or church, carrying the town's better self down a dusty road and back again. Grief and memorial are built into the floorboards. Women lead the quiet rituals, washing the departed, stitching the name into a shroud, organizing meals for the bereaved so sorrow doesn't have to cook. On the trail, there were shallow graves and hurried prayers. Here, there are tended plots and anniversaries that don't get lost. You begin to understand that westward expansion wasn't only land taken and homes made. It was also memory curated so children would know who they came from without a map. If you want to measure the distance between trail reality versus myth, look at a kitchen at dusk after a hard day that still ends with bread, a clean table, and 3 minutes of laughter. The unseen engine is running well, when it looks like nothing is happening and everyone is fed. You thank the hands that made the day possible, and you stack kindling for morning, because gratitude without preparation is just poetry. Tomorrow we'll widen the lens to the town square. Elections, juries, and the uneasy politics of a place learning to govern itself without losing the neighbourliness that got it this far. Market day becomes meeting day the moment somebody pounds a notice into the maple. You can smell pitch and ink before you read a word, and you already know what it will ask. Roads, bridges, school funds, and who gets to wear the badge when trouble borrows boots. The square looks like a yard sale for opinions, benches dragged from porches, a crate for a podium, a bell that refuses to ring on time. It's wagon train life reassembled with stationery, the circle of wagons replaced by the geometry of rows. You feel the old rhythm. Listen, bargain, commit. Only now the stakes are deeds and taxes. Trail reality versus myth turns into a ballot box with splinters. A justice of the peace sets up shop at a table. The wind keeps trying to close. He carries a ledger, a calm voice, and the kind of patience that pays interest. When neighbours present a fence line dispute, he has them walk it together, hat in hand, words slower than feet. The verdict is rarely dramatic, and often right enough, which is the best kind on the frontier. This is frontier survival, translated into civility. Save the gunpowder for wolves and fires. In the long echo of overland migration, process beats passion more often than not. Elections feel like barn raisings, where you lift a future instead of rafters. You swear an oath, scrawl a name that looks like a fence in a windstorm, and drop your folded paper into a box that smells faintly of pine tar. Nobody campaigns with bunting. They campaign with road crews, honest scales, and who showed up when the creek took the bridge. The winners get a handshake and a list of problems. The losers get a slice of pie and the same list with a pencil. Westward expansion works best when power looks like chores you volunteered for. Sheriff is a word that tastes different out here. It means the person who can talk a drunk into going home, talk a hothead into counting to 20, and talk himself into a saddle at midnight when the storm is arguing with fences. He knows everyone's dogs by bark, and everyone's sins by rumour, and he carries both lightly. In a town built by survivors of Oregon Trail hardships, authority that doesn't understand mercy won't last a season. The badge is a mirror. It shows what people hope about themselves. Courts arrive on wheels. Circuit riders with law books wrapped in oilcloth and a raincoat that has argued with every county twice. Trials take place in a schoolhouse that smells like slate and chalk, with jurors whose boots remember mud in a dozen states. You sit, you swear, you listen, until your ears feel as honest as your hands. Facts are dusted off, the temper cooled, and a verdict tested against the simple math of, will we still work together tomorrow? That's pioneer journey wisdom. Justice that can't share a fence line isn't justice you can afford. Taxes are the frontier version of a long wagon grade. Grumbled about, necessary, and easier if you lean into them together. The levy for a bridge is agreed upon in less time than it takes stew to simmer, because everyone remembers the winter a neighbour fell through and the ferry froze. The school gets a roof that doesn't leak because mothers showed up to vote, and the preacher's voice loses a little thunder when the hall finally gets a proper stove. You learn quickly that the bill for prevention is cheaper than the bill for repair. Trail reality versus myth had promised freedom without receipts. The ledger says otherwise. Water rights turn neighbours into legislators, whether they want the hat or not. A ditch cut an inch too high can starve a field. A dam built an hour too early can drown a barn. So you meet, you mark. You measure with strings and tempers, and you write it down where rain can't blur it. Enforcement looks like good sense, walking with a witness. Frontier survival depends on grammar for rivers, not just poetry about them. Not every fight shows up wearing boots. Some arrive dressed as markets. Weights and measures get tested with a seriousness that would embarrass a cathedral. A scale that cheats is a fire that spreads. You stamp the honest ones and shame the others into retirement. Fair dealing is public health for towns. If wagon train life taught anything, it was that trust cuts the cost of every mile and every pound of flour. Religion and newspapers set the tone when tempers try to write the chorus. A circuit preacher reminds people that stealing fence rails is a sin, even when winters are long, and the editor reminds them that gossip is also a sin, even when print looks flattering. You might disagree with both by supper time, but you're grateful someone is willing to be boring on schedule. Overland migration needed weather reports. Settlement needs editorials. Both work best when they underpredict disaster and overdeliver caution. The square turns into a muster field when thunder means hooves rather than clouds. A posse forms with more rope than rifles because catching thieves alive keeps grudges from multiplying. You remember prairie schooner circling and realize the old maneuver lives in your bones? Protect the vulnerable, put the stubborn to work, let the cool-headed count. Vigilantes burn hot and fade. Institutions burn slow and hold. Trail reality versus myth prefers the slow fire once people have kids. Evening councils feel different than morning meetings. Lamplight softens statements. Pies negotiate better than pistols, and the dog snoring under the table reminds everyone why you're doing this in the first place. A town that can argue without breaking learns to grow without limping. When hail flattens, seedlings or sudden torrents take a foot of riverbank, the same people who fought over ditch inches will stack sandbags shoulder to shoulder. That's Oregon Trail hardships paying dividends in character. By the end of the year, the town has a vocabulary it didn't know it needed. Ordinance, minutes, quorum, appeal. None of it is heroic. All of it is how you beat chaos without pretending you're immortal. The bell rings truer, the ballot box looks less like a crate, and children learn the names of months the way you once learned the names of rivers. You realize the hardest part of westward expansion wasn't crossing the land. It was teaching yourselves to stay without sharpening your knives. Tomorrow we'll turn to the shadows that still haunt the road, bandit trails, winter famines, and the quiet toll of those silent graves that kept the price of the promise honest. Some dangers waited in plain sight. Others took their boots off and crept. Bandit trails braided into freight roads, and you learned to read hoofprints like ledger entries. Too many shod horses, no wagon ruts, camp ash still warm, someone's shopping at night. A posse could scatter thieves, but reputation did better. A town known to ride together kept more bacon than a town that bragged and slept. This was frontier survival written in posture before it was written in law. Out here you guarded the road, the way a miller guards his gear, quietly, constantly, without speeches. Hunger was the older, colder outlaw. A late freeze, a wormy bin, a bridge lost to a sudden torrent, and suddenly supper became arithmetic with sharp elbows. Families who had survived Oregon Trail hardships knew the drill. Thin the stew, share the fire, rotate the hope. You salted the last side of pork, like it was a treaty. And you treated seed corn like a saint's bone, revered, not eaten. Myth promised abundance at the edge of the map. Trail reality versus myth reminded you that maps don't plant. Winter taught the disciplined summer only praise. Disease never stopped auditing the books. The same dysentery that stalked wagon train life could return with one lazy bucket. Camp fever loved crowded cabins as much as crowded camps. You boiled water until time itself seemed purified, limed the outhouse path like a boundary spell, and kept vinegar by the door for flaws and pride. On the trail you survived by miles. In town you survived by habits. Overland migration had trained your hands. Now, those hands kept the cradle and the table out of trouble. Accidents were democratic. They visited the careful and the careless alike. A saw kicked an ox spooked, a rifle slipped off a peg, and a good day became a jury of neighbors deciding what to do next. You built redundancies the way you built rafters, pairs, braces, backups for the backup. Every tool had a place because panic loves clutter. The truth was boring, and therefore precious. Order keeps you alive longer than bravery does. That's advice the pioneer journey had tried to give you since independence. Then there were the rivers still grading your homework. A thaw turned a polite ford into a rumour with teeth. Ice lied about thickness just because it could. You remembered how to caulk wagons, how to throw a rope the way you throw a sentence, clean and to the point, and how to count heads before and after anything that splashed. Even settled the road lived in your reflexes. Prairie schooners might be parked, but the river never parked its opinions. Death came quieter now, but it still arrived. On the trail, there were shallow graves and trailside crosses that leaned into wind. Here there were fences, willow, and names carved straight, letter by letter. Funerals were work before they were words. Washing, digging, cooking, sitting. You learned that mourning is a community chore, disguised as tenderness. The cemetery held a record. The courthouse couldn't, who you loved enough to keep clean every spring. That ledger kept westward expansion honest. Fear made some people loud. It made the wise precise. A farm that looked humble but kept tools sharp, water clean, and neighbours' clothes usually outlived a boastful one, with shiny hinges and dull shovels. You stopped measuring success in acres and started measuring it in winters survived without selling the plough. That's the quiet math frontier survival respects. The road had taught spectacle. The valley rewarded sequence. Trade could turn cruel when scarcity pressed a thumb on the scale. You watched for the merchant who lost a pound to clever weights, and you watched yourself for the kind of hunger that makes a thief of a decent person. Public weighing days, scales in the square, everyone watching, kept a peace better than sermons. Fairness was infrastructure. Trail reality versus myth had said freedom meant doing as you pleased. Reality said freedom meant agreeing on honest measures. Even justice learned to walk softly. Vigilantes burned hot and sometimes wrong. Juries moved slow and tended to land where tomorrow could live. A sheriff who rode hard but rode neatly kept the town together. Out on patrol, lamplight in the window meant you could come home with the dark, still friendly. This was governance born from wagon train life. Circles that became rows, watch lists that became minutes, oaths that sounded like chores. Nature kept the biggest stick, and everyone knew it. Prairie lightning could draft a fire line where morning wanted pasture. Hail squalls could erase half a garden in a verse and a chorus. You learned to stack sandbags when the river hummed a bad key, to clear gutters like a ritual, to cut fire breaks before the wind needed an audience. The sky remained the senior partner. Oregon Trail hardships had shaken your pride. The seasons finished the job and left you with competence. What saved you again and again was the muscle memory of hell. A knock at midnight meant dress warm and not bring money. Buckets thumped in handing rhythm. Ropes went tight in 2 breaths. Children were counted by the same neighbours who scolded them yesterday. You could feel overland migration inside these moments, the old circle reappearing without the wagons. Civilization wasn't a courthouse. It was a habit of arriving. The debt that followed you west was also the dividend. The road taught you to see threats early, to stalk more than pride, to love boring routines more than handsome dangers. The graves taught you to finish sentences with care. The winters taught you that luck is what planning looks like from far away. Hold on to those truths, and the promise of the valley finally matches the porch. Tomorrow we'll open the ledger on culture. Songs, stories, and how humour kept people from breaking when the land refused to bend. By the time fences stand straight and the stove learns your name, you notice that culture is not a luxury. It's a survival kit you open every evening. Music turns up first because it fits in a pocket. Fiddle, jaw harp, a voice that can carry across a yard without waking the baby. Chords clean the day off your shoulders faster than soap ever could. Journey tried to grind out, a waltz quietly stitches back together. You watch calloused hands keep time on a table and realize community has a heartbeat, and you can hear it. Stories arrive next, half true and fully useful. Around lamplight you trade tales about the Platte running backward in a windstorm and the prairie schooners that sailed it, which is nonsense with a purpose. It reminds you that impossible things sometimes behave if you're stubborn and polite. A good yarn gives you a safer map of fear. It puts teeth on the monster and then lends you pliers. On the trail, talk kept legs moving. In town, talk keeps legs from walking away when chores say, "Not yet." That's trail reality versus myth, doing its best work, warning without paralyzing. Children become the first librarians. They memorize verses quicker than adults find their slippers, and the schoolhouse becomes a vault for riddles, Bible lines, and tall tales that hide practical advice in their pocket. You teach them songs that count steps for churning and rhythms for chopping, work set to meter so boredom can't grow teeth. Wagon train life gave kids chores, settlement gives them roles, and nothing keeps trouble out of a yard like a child with a job and a tune. Culture, at its best, is discipline disguised as delight. Humour is the grease that keeps neighbours from grinding each other down. When a fence collapses, somebody says it wanted a better view, and tempers drop 3 degrees. When the Oregon Trail hardships memory sneaks up on a widow at the well, the storekeeper mangles a proverb so thoroughly she has to laugh in self-defense. Jokes aren't denial, they're vent holes cut in the pressure tank. In frontier survival, laughter is PPE, personal psychological equipment, and anyone who mocks it has never hauled a winter through March. Sunday gatherings become the frontier's streaming service. Hymns, potlucks, recitations, the same plot every week, and that's the point. People bring their best pie and their worst week, and both get handled with care. A neighbour recites a speech they've half memorized from a crumpled newspaper. The editor reads the funniest letters he couldn't print. The preacher time boxes his thunder because the stew is cooling. You leave with your calendar aligned to something kinder than weather. That's westward expansion learning tempo. Printed words trickle in and then cascade. A shared almanac tells moon phases and jokes with equal confidence. A tattered novel makes the rounds until its spine knows every porch. Once a month, a stage drops off a newspaper that smells like faraway rain. You argue with editorials, borrow phrases for town meetings, and steal recipes in the margins. Overland migration taught you to read rivers. Now you learn to read opinion, gently, alertly, with both boots on. Dances are engineering projects disguised as joy. Floors get sanded, benches shoved back, and lanterns hung high enough that elbows behave. Someone calls the figures, someone else fetches water. Every shy person is claimed by a partner before nerves can write an alibi. You witness feuds shrink to fit inside a reel and stay there long enough to cool off. In the ledger of wagon train life, a dance is both maintenance and investment. Shoes wear down, but friendships get resolved. Craft becomes language, and language becomes pride you can use. Quilts log weather, births, and roots in patterns only grandmothers can fully decode. Carvings on bedposts confirm that a house has stories worth sleeping inside. A blacksmith stamps a maker's mark so neat it might as well be a signature on the town's constitution. All of it is wealth you don't have to lock. Trail reality versus myth had promised gold. You discovered inheritance you can sit on. Even grief gets choreography. Memorial suppers are potlucks with instructions: bring bread, a memory, and no improvements on the truth. The cemetery teaches you to tell a life in 3 sentences that still feel warm. On the road, there were silent graves and hurry. Here, there are names read aloud, the kind of attention that refuses to let weather win. Mourning becomes a communal art, which is another way of saying the town understands interest. Love paid forward with food and listening. Cross-cultural exchange is not a pamphlet, it's a neighbour. Trade blankets, shared labour on a flood day, a lesson in basket weave or berry timing. These are the quiet collaborations that never make speeches. You learn that respect is built like fences, post by post, line by line, checked after storms. Westward expansion often spoke loudly and listened poorly. You aim for the opposite. Practical friendships keep a lot of history from repeating itself badly. Holidays adapt to the latitude. Independence Day, rockets become safe piles of thunder, drums, anvils, and children yelling, "Huzzah!" without falling off their dignity. Harvest suppers look like gratitude you can eat. Winter fairs look like denial with better mittens. None of it would rate a paragraph in a city paper, which is the secret of its power. Culture that lasts is the culture that doesn't audition. That's pioneer journey wisdom, older than any statue. Finally, the best proof that culture works. When trouble hits, the fiddle case opens by itself. Bucket lines move in rhythm. Jokes arrive on time, and stories keep panic from recruiting. You realize you didn't just cross a continent. You transported a toolkit for staying human under pressure. When the lamps go out at the end of a long day, the silence feels earned, not empty. Tomorrow, we'll tune that silence toward the classroom. How schools and books made sure the next generation could read maps, minutes, and weather with the same steady confidence. The first school doesn't look like much. One room, rough benches, a bell that takes persuasion. But it shifts the town's center of gravity the moment the door opens. Parents who conquered Oregon Trail hardships suddenly argue about slates, primers, and whether a globe is a luxury or an investment. A blackboard goes up, and with it a promise. Tomorrow's adults won't have to guess the spelling of their own future. You notice how the smell of pine shavings and lamp oil feels like hope with a job to do. In frontier survival, learning is not a pastime. It's insurance you can fold and put in a pocket. The pioneer journey didn't end at the valley, it learned its letters. Teachers arrive the way rain does, unevenly, but with consequences. Some are widows who can out-argue a judge and out-kind a nurse. Some are boys with city manners and a backbone that improves by Christmas. All bring a trunk of books and a talent for turning chaos into order with a clap and a look. They teach phonics, penmanship, and peace treaties for recess. In Wagon Train, life leaders were chosen by the mile. In town, the school chooses them by the sentence. You watch respect take root, because it's watered daily, not demanded loudly. Curriculum is a quilt stitched from what survived the trip and what the freighter remembered to unload. McGuffey Bible verses, arithmetic on slates that squeak like mice, and maps that still put C's where your oxen scraped their knees. Geography lessons become quiet recaps of overland migration. Spelling lists smuggle in vocabulary for fences, mills, and minutes. When the teacher writes and underlines it twice, you feel how westward expansion becomes responsibility as well as real estate. The room is small. The consequences are not. Attendance runs on harvest, mud, and the number of boots that can still be patched. Yet children appear wind-chapped and stubborn, with reader boards tucked under arms and a loaf to share. If the teacher's pantry is thin, older students herd younger ones, and a single stove teaches more civics than a pamphlet. Everyone warms up, nobody crowds out. The town learns that literacy is a team sport. Trail reality versus myth had promised individual heroics. School teaches synchronized effort that doesn't need trumpets. Discipline is gentle and exacting, like a good yoke. Rules get posted in careful script. Hats off, hands clean, mouths kind. A length of hickory leans in the corner, mostly for dust. The teacher's eyebrow does more work than the stick ever will. When quarrels flare, they're assigned to the sentence bench. I will not borrow without asking, copied until the ink runs out of excuses. This is frontier survival recalibrated, not whose fist, but whose fairness. Books move from rare artifacts to household tools. A reader that made 12 laps around the settlement becomes so familiar it could run for office. Families trade night lamp time like currency. Older children stumble through chapters and then bloom, almost overnight, into people who correct the editor's punctuation under their breath. A town that once measured wealth in prairie schooners now measures it in pages. Even the miller keeps a ledger of new words posted where sacks are weighed. Writing changes how people stand in their own lives. Letters home stop being dictated to the one neighbour with tidy script and start pouring out in many hands, complete with jokes, weather, and the brag. Every mother craves, we have a school. Minutes of meetings get neater. Contracts get shorter, because no one needs the scenic route to say, paid. In wagon train, life oaths were spoken. In town, signatures hold. Ink, it turns out, is a kind of fence that keeps misunderstandings from grazing your pasture. Sneaks in through the side door, labelled common sense. Seed experiments line a windowsill. A jar of creek water grows interesting on warm weeks and gets boiled on principle. A barometer someone ordered off a stage line becomes the most popular gossip in the county. Thorns that used to ambush now announce themselves to children who can read a dial. That's overland migration evolving, from watching the sky with fear to measuring it with curiosity. The same hands that once corked wagons now graph rainfall. Music and recitation. Nights convert the schoolhouse into a community amplifier. Families pack benches, lamp wicks trimmed just right, make halos over heads. A harmonica turns nerves into bravery. Kids belt out poems about westward expansion that rhyme plough with no, and nobody minds the meter. Laughter oils grudges. Applause pays debts you can't put on paper. The school becomes the safe place where stories practice becoming history. Hard seasons test the institution the way storms test a bridge. During a hungry winter, the teacher adds soup duty to the curriculum, and attendance actually rises because a ball can be a sentence that starts with where. When dysentery surfaces in 3 cabins, the school becomes a bulletin board. For sanitation rules everyone forgot they knew on the road. Boil water, lime the path, wash hands like pride depends on it. Oregon Trail hardships are reviewed, not romanticized. Learning is leverage against repeating the worst chapters. Not everyone agrees on everything. And that's precisely why school matters. Debates over textbooks, taxes, and whether a girl needs algebra or just impeccable handwriting sharpen the town's tools for arguing without splintering. The teacher moderates like a seasoned captain, eyes on the chart, voice steady, course adjusted only when the evidence insists. In a place built by compromise with land and weather, compromise with each other becomes a teachable skill. Trail reality versus myth grows up into civics. By spring the bell has the nerve to ring like it means it. Children race the mud to class. Parents linger at the door to read the new notice about examinations and a picnic that will be more work than leisure and exactly worth it. The schoolhouse doesn't make the frontier easy. It makes it legible. You can feel the town learning to read itself. Strengths underlined, errors corrected, future written on a clean slate. Tomorrow We'll walk the mail road and the telegraph line. How messages outran storms, how news altered tempers, and how a wire strung across emptiness changed what far away meant. Before the wire distance behaved like a stubborn mule. A letter could ride a month of weather and arrive carrying news that had already grown old. Then a track got beaten into the prairie, ruts to the ferry, ferry to the divide, divide to the agency, and the stage began to keep an almost musical schedule. Dusty coaches showed up with newspapers that smelled like other people's rain, and suddenly arguments in the square had footnotes. Wagon train life had been motion for survival. Now movement brought information. That shift changed tempers as surely as plows changed fields, and it made frontier survival feel less like guessing and more like planning. The stage stop looked like a handshake between road and roof. Corral, trough, kitchen, bench, and a porch that understood eavesdropping. Drivers swapped teams with the grace of a blacksmith's hammer. 3 steps, 1 word, buckle, go. Passengers emerged shaped like the seat they'd survived, blinking at a horizon that had not moved for them in days. The agent's clock set the town's pulse. If the stage was late, stew burned and rumours fattened. In the old mouth of Oregon Trail hardships, time had bullied you. Now, for the first time, you could bully time back with timetables. Mail made people taller. A widow unfolded a letter and found a future invitation tucked between the lines. A farmer read a price for wheat in a city he'd never see and adjusted his planting as if he were standing on that street. Even the bad news, the illness, the foreclosure, the war no one had wanted, arrived with an odd grace. At least you knew. Trail reality versus myth had advertised adventure. The truth was that certainty, not excitement, made families braver. Knowledge turned worry into work. Newspapers were the frontier's public square on paper. Editorials told you how men with clean boots thought a town should behave. Advertisements told you who had extra plows and who had a daughter ready to teach music. Legal notices told you when land changed, names, and why. You learned to read bias the way you learned to read clouds, which shade brought rain, which brought thunder. Overland migration had taught you to follow rivers. The broadsheet taught you to follow money and ideas without leaving your porch. A shared copy could travel 20 kitchens before the ink gave up. Then the telegraph arrived, thin as a violin string and twice as bossy. Poles marched across emptiness like commas in a long sentence, and the click of the key made even the stove listen. Messages shrank from paragraphs to pulses. You learned to compress thought into something a wire could carry without losing its manners. The first time the key chattered about a might change back east. The miller altered his rate before the stage crested the hill. That was westward expansion in a new tense, present, not future perfect. The operator became half priest, half bookkeeper, guardian of other people's hurry. She translated dots and dashes into births, market shocks, and a rare stop everything from a governor too far to ride. Privacy was part etiquette, part architecture. Doors shut, logs kept neat, rumours staffed on principle. In a community welded by pioneer journey hardships, trust was a utility. You paid for it as surely as you paid for nails. A careless operator could break a town faster than hail. Communication changed weather, from a bully to a partner. A storm report up the line brought you 10 hours of sandbagging, haystacking, and ladder checking that no sermon could have organised as quickly. Fire jump warnings travelled faster than sparks. When the river started, a sudden torrent, the upstream key tapped. RIEs, E and downstream buckets were already waking. Frontier survival had always depended on neighbours. The wire just lengthened the street. Not all news helped. Speculation galloped in with telegraphed rumours about gold and rail routes, and more than one steady hand went wobbly chasing someone else's luck. The paper printed retractions. The town printed lessons. You developed a new discipline. Let the first report sit overnight, like bread dough that might still collapse. Trail reality versus myth put on a new mask. Hype, and the cure, as ever, was people who remembered that beans and fences pay better than maybes. Stages and wires also knitted cultures that might otherwise have stayed strangers. Trade notices in the broadsheet turned into shared festivals, a telegraphed plea for help after a flood turned into wagons full of lumber from 3 towns upriver. Recipes travelled, songs migrated, and a quilting pattern from a woman you would never meet still warmed your winter. Wagon train life had taught you to share paths. Communication taught you to share plans. The economy learned to sprint. A merchant could order bolts of cloth before a wedding season, and the cloth could arrive in time to keep promises. A farmer could sell a surplus to a buyer who lived only as far as the wire could carry your name. Far away, bent under the weight of coordination. Remember how your prairie schooners had blurred the line between courage and luck? Stages and telegraph pushed luck off the ledger and put scheduling in its place. There were costs. Clock got teeth. Deadlines moved from weather and harvest to people and paper, and some folks missed the gentler tyranny of sunrise and chores. A quarrel that once cooled over 3 weeks of mail could now flame in an afternoon's exchange of clipped sentences. You learned a second discipline. Write the thing you'll be proud to have arrived while you're still making supper. Oregon Trail hardships had punished impatience with broken wheels. The New World punished it with broken friendships. And yet, standing by a pole in late light, you could hear the country hum to itself. Clicks from north, clicks from south, a language of insistence that somehow felt like hope. The road had taught you how to move. The wire taught you how to belong to a place larger than what your boots could touch. Tomorrow we'll watch the railroad crest the horizon. Iron, steam, and a timetable that threatened to retire the stage, rewrite markets, and make even the old trail feel like a rumor told at recess. The first whistle sounds like a dare. People step onto porches, wipe hands on aprons, and look east long before the plume shows over the cottonwoods. Then it comes, iron, steam, a brass face that refuses to blink, and the town's heartbeat stumbles, then speeds up to match. Trains don't just arrive, they instruct. Schedules replace guesses, and a depot platform becomes a new kind of town square where news smells like coal smoke. Wagon train, life had taught you to treat distance like a mountain. The locomotive teaches you it's a staircase, if you lay the steps right. Rails reorganize the map without asking your permission. What used to be 3 weeks by freight wagon becomes 2 days and a pot of coffee. And markets that only existed as rumors in a broadsheet suddenly send invoices with deadlines. Wheat can leave before it spoils. Lumber can arrive before your rafters sag. A cousin you haven't seen since independence steps down with city dust on his shoes and stories that bend your sense of scale. This is westward expansion in a new grammar. Verbs like ship, schedule, and invest join the old standbys of plough and pray. Reality versus myth adjusts its costume and keeps talking. The depot turns into a chore list disguised as an opportunity. You build warehouses with honest floorboards, a scale house that refuses to lie, and a water tower that groans like a useful elder. Sidetracks grow like veins. A telegraph bay chats with the world faster than the stage ever managed. Freight agents learn to price a mile by the hour. Not the blister and Carmen with lanterns move like punctuation at dusk. Frontier survival changes tools. Less lariat, more ledger, fewer ox yokes, more bill of lading. Commerce sprints. Cattle that once plodded for months now ride steel. Flour prices react to cities you'll never visit. A crate of stoves lands in time to save a winter from turning into folklore. The economy becomes nimble enough to feel impatient, which is both thrilling and dangerous. Men who measured success by stacks of cordwood start measuring it by turnarounds and credit. You can hear the difference in the way people talk at the store. Fewer sighs about mud, more arguments about margins. Overland migration had been motion for survival. The railroad makes motion into strategy. But every gift comes with an invoice. Coal ash settles on wash lines, noise edits the dawn, and the timetable starts disciplining birthdays and funerals. Carloads of strangers step down with business in their pockets, and sometimes trouble under their hats. Land speculation sharpens like a knife. Lots along the track triple, while fields a mile out feel suddenly shy. Trail reality versus myth. Once sold freedom as empty space. The rails prove space gets crowded by ideas long before bodies catch up. You learn to keep your wits as sharp as your scythe. Labour builds empires in weather that would scare poetry. Track players, immigrants, veterans, farm boys between harvests. Swing steel in cadence, tamp ties, and eat dust that tastes like overtime. Section, cruise, patrol, the line with handcars that squeak like determined mice. Summers boil, winters bite, and spring floods test every culvert faster than your nerve can count. It's Oregon Trail hardships with different villains and better tools. The miracle isn't the locomotive, it's the hands that make it think it's inevitable. Time itself gets standardized, which feels like witchcraft the first week and like common sense by the second. Noon is no longer where your shadow says it is, it's where the timetable needs it to be. Church bells and school bells surrender to depot clocks, and meetings start to begin when the paper says, not when the last team crests the hill. Some old-timers grumble about railroad time, then secretly appreciate how often supper now lands hot. Pioneer journey patience meets industrial precision, and the handshake mostly holds. The old road doesn't die, it graduates. Freight wagons become feeders to the railhead. Ferries turn to bridge approaches, and your beloved prairie schooners retire into hay wrecks, freighters, or the kind of yard relic that starts stories with, when we came west, the memory of overland migration becomes a local credential rather than a daily grind, and you discover you can honor it without reenacting it. The trail's courage becomes a depot, town's competence. Wagon train, life still teaches, now about redundancy, grit, and what to do when the schedule hiccups. Culture changes tempo alongside freight. Traveling theatre companies tumble out of coaches. Pianos arrive that don't sound like wounded moose. Newspapers print the same day they're read. A library crate from a back east society births a reading club that argues with more nuance than the saloon ever did. Choirs borrow hymnals that still smell like another town's candles. Westward expansion finally gets a soundtrack that isn't only fiddle and wind, and households learn new recipes with ingredients they didn't think possible 2 winters ago. Not all consequences are kind. Rails cross hunting grounds and invite disputes the courthouse isn't ready to solve. Some vanish faster than a sermon can scold. Fences multiply where paths once meandered with older memories. Some neighbours welcome the speed. Others count the costs in ways a ledger can't. The honest truth is that railroads accelerated everything. Prosperity, conflict, law, and loss. Trail reality versus myth must now account for whose stories got crowded off the timetable. A wise town admits the tension and looks for treaties that respect more than profit. Safety becomes policy rather than luck. Sparks breed grass fires, couplers pinch hands, boilers need temper more than muscle, and the river bridge sulks every thaw. You write ordinances about cinders post lookouts in July and drill bucket lines with a frequency that would make a colonel proud. The new risks don't excuse the old laziness. They demand better habits. That's frontier survival maturing. Keep the shovel, add the wrench, maintain the reflex to show up fast and steady. In the end, the railroad doesn't erase your story, it widens it. The whistle folds your town into a larger sentence, and you get to decide whether you're a comma, a semicolon, or a new paragraph. The trail taught endurance. The rails demand coordination. Keep the virtues that cross the plains: mutual aid, clean water, honest scales, and marry them to timetables that serve people, not the other way around. Do that, and the iron horse feels less like a conqueror and more like a partner. Tomorrow we'll ride those rails to the edge of industry, mills scaling up, mechanized harvests, boom and bust cycles, and see how a frontier that once measured life in miles starts measuring it in cycles, interest and winters, survived with money still in the jar. The railroad didn't just deliver goods, it delivered tempo. Suddenly, the mill's rhythm had to match a timetable, and your town felt like someone had wound a spring inside it. Combines and reapers arrived on flat cars, smelling of oil, paint and promises that sounded suspiciously like interest rates. Where wagon train life had measured progress in creek crossings and clean axles, the new math counted bushels per acre, turns per day, and notes due on the 15th. You could hear the shift at dawn. Not only roosters and saws, but a whistle telling everyone to stop guessing. Trail reality versus myth revised its script. Grit still mattered, but timing started to matter more. Mechanization was a miracle with a maintenance schedule. A reaper could do in an afternoon what 6 men did in a day, provided the belt didn't snap and the teeth stayed sharp. You learned new verbs: grease, tension, replace, and discovered that a toolbox could be as holy as a plough. The field changed texture under steel. The rows came cleaner, the chaff flew higher, and your back carried fewer sermons from the sunset. Frontier survival didn't retire. It put on leather gloves and learned to listen for good noises versus expensive ones. In a way, this was still a pioneer journey, but now the miles were mechanical. Credit followed the rails like a second shadow. Storekeepers extended advances. Against harvest, banks issued mortgages, with smiles that meant sign here, and a bad season could turn that signature into winter's favourite ghost. You balanced ledgers, the way you once balanced wagons, redistributing weight, so nothing cracked at the worst point of the road. Prices back east sneezed, and your town caught a cold. Wheat fell 2 cents, and a family postponed a roof. Overland migration had tested muscle. Capital tested nerve. Boom years taught their own kind of laziness if you weren't careful. A fat harvest, a fair price, and the sudden temptation to borrow toward the bigger thresher with the brass fittings. Because what could go wrong when the sky looks this trustworthy? Then hail stitched the field, a river rose, or a fungus found the wheat's best argument and out-argued it. You learned to keep 1 foot on the brake, pay the blacksmith before the banker, fix the fence before the parlour, plant the second best seed, because it still germinates when the weather has a sense of humour. That's Oregon Trail hardships expressed in spreadsheets, not blisters. Industry concentrated noise. The way storms concentrate water. The expanded mill thumped a steady bass line night and day. The planing mill shrieked an opinion about every board, and the depot clanged like a polite emergency. Workbenches collected new tools whose names felt like immigrants. Reamer, micrometer, monkey wrench, and kids learn fractions faster because bolts demand them. Westward expansions stopped looking like empty maps and started looking like shop drawings. Underneath, the old virtues kept paying: honest scales, clean water, and neighbours who show up when a belt flies. Labour changed shape and then changed politics. Hired hands organised by coffee pot and rumour. Foremen learned that a steady word prevents more accidents than a loud one, and paydays became a calendar's spine rather than a suggestion. The town board discovered that ordinances about hours and safety went Eastern nonsense, but the difference between prosperity and funerals. You could feel trail reality versus myth cooling the theatrical heroics and warming up procedural competence. The best days ended with all 10 fingers still counting. Drought walked in wearing dust and took a chair without asking. Combined stood like iron cattle while men watched the sky. For news the telegraph could not deliver. You learned to love windbreaks, cisterns, and crop rotation, the way you once loved a steady ford. When the field sulked, the garden carried the tune. Beans, potatoes, a row of stubborn onions that never believed in boom or bust. The skill set of wagon train, rationing, repairing, sharing, rose from habit to policy. That's how frontier survival handles climate. Systems, not speeches. Markets had personalities, and none of them were patient. A rumour of surplus from somewhere you'd never see could pancake prices before you finished lunch, and a rail strike 3 states away could make nails as mythical as unicorns. You built redundancies. Second supplier, extra belt, a shed that stored optimism in the form of parts soaked in oil against rust. Families that favoured backups over bragging lasted longer than families that upgraded bragging before backups. The old prairie schooners had taught you to carry spares. Now your barn learned the same accent. Culture adjusted to industry rather than surrendering to it. Saturday nights still meant fiddles, but the set list now included a piano, rolled off a boxcar, and hymns printed on fresh broadsheets. The school taught bookkeeping alongside penmanship, because contracts are just stories with math. Newspapers ran grain price columns next to birth announcements, folding hope and caution onto the same page. You watched overland migration become a civics class about coordination, with gossip as an early warning system for both opportunities and scams. Not all progress smelled like roses. Mill waste fouled the creek, cinders freckled laundry, and the loudest men in the saloon discovered that speculation looks handsomer than sweat until it doesn't. Towns argued over zoning before they had the word for it, drawing invisible lines between where children sleep and where boilers complain. When the vote came, the best argument was still the trail-born one. What keeps us alive in February? Trail reality versus myth has never lost a debate framed that way. When bust finally arrived, as it always does somewhere in a long story, you used the muscle memory of scarcity. Families braided households for the winter. The church kitchen ran longer hours, and credit came to mean neighbour who remembers your help in 73. Men who once led wagon columns now organised fuel drives. Women who orchestrated water and bread on the trail ran soup lines with the same efficient mercy. You rediscovered that pioneer journey leadership is just crisis management with better boots. The lesson that stuck wasn't anti-machine or anti-market. It was anti-amnesia. Keep the steel, keep the schedule, but never forget the verbs that carried you. Repair, rotate, ration, respect the sky. Use boom years to buy boring resilience, cisterns, spare belts, a roof that laughs at sleet. Let kids learn both lathe and ledger, both hymn and headline. If you can do that, the next cycle becomes weather, not judgment. And just beyond this chapter waits the story that always comes last. Memory itself. How the road you travelled gets mythologized into textbooks, games, and campfire tales, and what to keep honest when the past starts dressing up for company. Memory arrives with wood smoke and a harmonica. Around a reunion fire, people retell the pioneer journey as if the canvas still snaps in the wind, and the coffee still tastes like alkali. The stories keep what courage wants, and lose what sorrow can't carry twice. Our trail reality versus myth sneaks in. We edit the dust and keep the sunrise, edit the Oregon Trail hardships and keep the handshake. Yet, even as the tale softens, someone always adds the clink of a tin cup, the ache in a shoulder, the smell of rain on sage. History survives when details refuse to be evicted. Textbooks do their own laundering. After Huggins, a paragraph on overland migration compresses 500 miles into 6 neat sentences, a map arrow into a promise fulfilled. The bolded terms, South Pass, Barlow Road, Willamette Valley, feel like stepping stones across a stream that never soaks your boots. Teachers do their best, but page counts are stingy and anniversaries allowed. The curriculum saves names and spends grief. We get the mileage and miss the splinters. In the margins, a student doodles a wagon and doesn't know what a broken tongue sounds like in a crosswind. Museums push back with artifacts that refuse to blink. A real prairie schooner looks smaller than the legend and heavier than the brochure. Its floorboards tell truth with dents. Display cases hold louse combs, bonnet pins, and a clay marble a child dropped in 1852. You read an interpretive panel, step outside to the preserved ruts, and the earth itself finishes the lesson. Wagon train. Life was not a musical. It was a geometry of weight and weather, a choreography of inches. Touch the wood, inhale the tar, and the myth loses its perfume. Pop culture both helps and harms. Films give you skies and violins, but often trade frontier survival for fistfights that never end, and bonnets that never sweat. Novels build interior worlds that diaries only hint at, then sometimes gallop into melodrama, because sails enjoy gallops. The road becomes a set, the hardships become acts, and the pioneer journey gets a lighting designer. The fix isn't to ban spectacle, it's to seat it behind the primary sources and make it take notes. Games taught a generation something real, wrapped in pixels. You remember the green screen frontier where you have died of dysentery became a classroom proverb. It's funny until you read a journal that describes the bloody flux with a mother's handwriting and a date. The simulation gets the logistics right, rations, repairs, fords, and misses the way grief rearranges a family in silence. Keep the mechanics, add the human weight. That turns trail, reality versus myth, into empathy without losing the learning. The land remembers with its own handwriting. Trailside crosses long gone, willow markers folded back into riverbanks, cairns scattered by hooves and time. Road crews sometimes find bones in places maps forgot. Archaeologists kneel and histories inside, voice returns. Small historical societies keep ledgers of the found and the known, and they host gatherings where names are returned to stones. Silent graves are curriculum. You approach with a hat off and a pen ready. Missing voices now get microphones, slowly, imperfectly, necessarily. Westward expansion wasn't a solitary march, but an occupation with consequences. Tribes who watched wagons pass also watched buffalo vanish and treaties wrinkle. Newer exhibits share indigenous roots and river grammars, and you realize the wilderness was a neighborhood with rules before you arrive. We can honor endurance without romanticizing erasure. The road gets truer when more feet are visible on it. Diaries and letters refuse to be neat. A day might contain sand-choked axles, a joke about rancid bacon, and a birth announced with 3 sentences and an underlined name. Men's voices, children's scrawls, a teamster's spelling that would alarm a schoolmarm and delight a poet. This is the chorus that keeps you honest. Overland migration becomes dinner table, intimate. Sleeves rolled, ink blotted, truth told sideways, and therefore remembered. Read enough pages, and your lungs start timing sentences to a walking pace. Reenactments and festivals can rescue the tactile. Dutch ovens thicken stew you can actually smell. Oxen stand there like history with eyelashes. A farrier turns iron into obedience for hooves that don't read signs. When the event stays curious, rather than cosplay spectators, become students who leave with sore hands and better questions. Ask about corked wagons and watch a demonstrator grin. Ask about water caches and learn where judgment still lives. Wagon train, life returns briefly to 3 dimensions. Highways lay their asphalt over old ruts and swear they're new. Exit signs red like a memorial. Chimney Rock Fort Laramie, the Dallas. And you can get a burger where once a captain counted clouds for weather. Modern tires float where wooden wheels once dug in, but some bends of the Platte still smell like yesterday. A good roadside plaque can make a commuter into a citizen for 5 minutes. Trail reality versus myth improves every time a traveller pulls over and lets the wind do the talking. If there's a portable rule for memory, it's the same one that got families across: sequence before story. Remove the lies, air, the gaps. Replace with sources sent, lightly with art. Let Oregon Trail hardships be hard enough to teach and tender enough to honor. Keep the ledger and the lullaby in the same drawer. That blend is how frontier survival graduates into wisdom, which leaves you here holding 2 maps, the one with tidy arrows and the one with mud on it. Take both. Teach both. When someone says the past was simpler, hand them a louse comb and a diary and let silence do the rest. When someone says the past was only brutal, hand them a quilt square and a fiddle and let a waltz finish the paragraph. The road becomes truest when it keeps its splinters and its songs. And now that our map is honest, let's open the story with both hands. By now, you can feel the road in your bones, the alkali taste, the creak of wood that kept promises under pressure, the way wagon train life turned noise into routine. Strip the romance, and what remains is more useful: a blueprint. Oregon Trail hardships weren't cinematic. They were procedural: water first, fire second, words last. Measure, ration, repair, keep neighbours close and pride on a leash. The lesson is not that the past was tougher. It's that ordinary people chose systems over speeches until a path became a place. If we're honest, that's the quiet genius of overland migration. And 'twas Margelier that encore. It recoded heroism from duel at dawn to breakfast on time, from grand gestures to precise habits that endured weather and grief. The pioneer journey wasn't a drum roll. It was a metronome. Yoke, walk, boil, mend, sing, repeat. And because they repeated, they survived. When you read the ledger of names and the silent graves that line the route, it isn't despair you inherit. It's discipline, wrapped in tenderness. We also face trail reality versus myth and let it rearrange our assumptions. The trail wasn't destiny. It was negotiation, with rivers that didn't care, with mountains that didn't move, with luck that couldn't be scheduled. What saved people wasn't swagger. It was checklists and mercy, the community reflex that got buckets moving before anyone chose a speech. In a world that still sells shortcuts, the road answers with 4 verbs that never age: prepare, adapt, cooperate, persist. And yet, there was music. Jokes that bought 10 more miles, lullabies that stitched frayed nerves, dances that put feuds on a leash for one evening. Culture wasn't decor. It was a tool that kept people human while frontier survival demanded calluses. Quilts recorded weather. Letters made far away feel less rude. School bells taught a new time where children could read both maps and minutes. That's the part worth stealing today. Let art shoulder some of the weight so courage doesn't have to carry it alone. So here's your pocket test for modern dust. When your day feels like a rutted track, ask, what's my water? What's my fire? What are the words that need saying after the chores are real? Which small routine is my ox yoke? The boring choice that keeps the whole wagon from breaking. Where are my prairie schooners? The tools that move the mission without demanding applause. And who's in my circle tonight? Counting heads before the wind decides the agenda. If this journey gave you fresh eyes for grit, share it with someone who loves history that breathes. Your comment can be the campfire where another traveller warms up. And if you want more deep dives that turn myths into usable wisdom, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It tells the algorithm we're worth packing for. Tap like if you learned even one trail trick you'll keep, and pass this along to a friend who's picking their own route through modern weather. We'll end where the road always ends, with a porch, a lantern, and the quiet knowledge that tomorrow is scheduled, not guaranteed. Keep your lists honest, your neighbours close, and your stories generous. The map may promise, the mud decides, but your routines write the verdict. That's the frontier's final gift: endurance with manners, courage that clocks in, and hope that knows how to cook.